Oh boy. It took a while, but I finally finished God Eater 2 Rage Burst, and I'm happy to say that I had a lot of fun with it. As far as where the game falls on the series timeline, it is the second game if you couldn't already tell. The vanilla game came out in late 2013 for the PSP and Vita, but this version of the game was never released outside of Japan. On February 9th, 2015, the game got an expansion in the form of God Eater 2 Rage Burst, and thankfully this version of the game did see a Western release a few months later. It initially came out on PS4 and Vita, but it did eventually receive a PC version the following year. To say that Rage Burst added a substantial amount to the game is kind of an understatement, because in addition to including vanilla God Eater 2 and all of its DLC, Rage Burst added several new chapters to the game, almost doubling its length, a new weapon, a new combat mechanic, more characters, more outfits, and some changes to the game's balancing. So as of this video, Rage Burst is the definitive version of God Eater 2. The game has a post-apocalyptic setting taking place several decades from now. Monsters known as Aragami have ravaged the Earth and most of its resources, and they can't be killed with normal weapons. So humanity, spearheaded by the global organization Fenrir, started looking into other means to combat them. The result was the Goddark, a weapon that's capable of damaging Aragami due to possessing the same oracle cells that they have. However, not just anyone can wield a Goddark, so it's not like they could just mass produce the things and hand them out like free food. Users have to pass a compatibility test first, in which they agree to take oracle cells into their own body. Assuming that the test is a success, the person, now considered a God Eater, receives a significant boost in physical strength and resistance to things like heavy attacks or harsh weather. Melee type Goddarks also have extendable mouths that allow the user to eat an Aragami for a temporary boost in power. During gameplay, this usually translates to increased movement speed, higher attack damage, greater defense, and oracle regeneration. And that's pretty much it for the game's setting and just a basic surface level description of what God Eaters actually are. God Eater 2 takes place roughly 3 years after the first game, and it opens with you, the protagonist, joining Blood Special Forces. This is a special unit of Fenrir that was put together by Rachel Claudius, and the God Eaters that end up forming the Blood unit are the cream of the crop. Because so far, there are 3 generations of God Eaters: the old types, the new types, and the blood members. The Goddark can take the form of either a melee weapon or a gun, and while the 2 newer generations possess both and can switch between them at will, first generation God Eaters wield Goddarks that are permanently stuck as one or the other. New types are essentially old types without the limitation I just mentioned. Their Goddarks have both a melee and ranged weapon built in, and they can freely switch between them whenever they want. And then the blood unit makes up the 3rd generation of God Eaters. In addition to having a snazzy looking armlet, they're implied to be stronger than the previous 2, and they can also use blood arts, which are special attacks I'll get into later. Now, during my first few hours video, I did predict that you wouldn't need any prior knowledge of God Eater 1 to enjoy this game, and after finishing the main story, I can now confidently say that no, you don't have to play any version of the first game to understand what's going on in 2. It'll definitely help, but God Eater 2's story sits comfortably on its own for the most part. Events from the first game are brought up sometimes, but the game does a fairly good job of catching you up when that does happen. Characters from the first game also make a reappearance here, and I'd say it's a similar situation to the Final Fantasy characters appearing in Kingdom Hearts. If you already know them, you'll pick up on it immediately, but if you don't know them, you're gonna kind of feel the game sort of nudging you, like, hey, remember this person? But they obviously won't mean much to you. They'll kind of just be there. And while you can take them out on most missions, they do take a backseat role for most of the story. The focus is definitely on the new God Eaters introduced in this game. As far as the quality goes, it's neck and neck with Resurrection for me. Both games have really good stories, and the combat was repetitive, but in a good way. Once you grew familiar with an Aragami weakness or their attack patterns, there was this pleasant rhythm to fights. Almost every mission felt like an epic boss fight, and it kinda made grinding fun if I'm being honest. You've got plenty of weapons at your disposal. You have 6 melee weapons, 4 guns, and 3 shield sizes to pick from. There are 3 different damage types in the game: slashing, crushing, and piercing, and each weapon either specializes in one damage type or deals a combination of 2. All weapons in the game have light and heavy attacks which can be performed both on the ground and in midair, and additionally they each have at least one unique ability that can be used by pressing either R1 and square for melee or R1 and circle for guns. I already covered these weapons in my Resurrection video, and I could tell you to just go back and watch that, but looking back, the audio quality in that video is aged pretty poorly, so I'll just talk about them again here. Short swords deal slashing and piercing damage. They're the lightest of the melee weapons, and feel free to take advantage of the faster attack speed and mid-air sidestepping. Its special ability is the Rising Edge, which launches the player into the air with an upward swing that can be followed up with an aerial combo. Most long swords deal slashing damage. They have a moderate attack speed and a moderate damage output. I used these quite a bit in the last game, but not so much in this game. Its special ability is the Zero Stance, which cancels your current combo and allows you to start a new one, leading to an indefinite combo if circumstances allow. You can also press R1 and square again to fire off an explosion from the side of the weapon. Buster swords deal a combination of slashing and crushing damage. They're slow but do lots of damage when you land a hit. Its special ability is the parrying upper, which allows the player to briefly block with the shield before following up with an upward swing, and you can also charge up a downward swing by holding down square. Take note that the character is stuck in place while charging up, and if you stop the charge prematurely you end up doing a light attack instead. Hammers only deal crushing damage. Out of all the weapons I use these the least. If I wanted something heavy hitting I'd usually just go with the Buster. Its special ability allows the player to ignite the thruster at the head and swing away at the target. Pressing this button combination again results in the player finishing the combo with a downward slam. Spears only deal piercing damage, and I warmed up to them a lot more in this game than I had previously. Its special ability allows the player to backflip out of harm's way, and just like the Buster, it can also be charged by holding down square. The player is allowed to move freely while the spear is charging though. Scythes only deal slashing damage. I became very fond of this weapon, and if I needed a slash I usually used this over the longsword. Its special ability allows the player to extend the blade and swipe at enemies around them. Additionally, if your stamina permits, you can bring the extended blade down on an enemy with triangle, and then pressing square and R1 once more reels the blade back in. Sniper guns deal piercing damage, and as the name implied, can be fired from far away. Its unique ability allows the player to cloak themselves and sneak up on origami without being detected. Assault guns deal a healthy mix of crushing and piercing, and they tend to have the cheapest bullets since they're meant to be fired rapidly. Its unique ability allows the player to quickly jump back. Blast guns deal crushing damage. Bullets tend to cost a lot of oracle to fire, but its unique ability does allow you to store up to 9 bars of reserve. The shields aren't very complicated. Bucklers are the smallest and absorb some of the damage from incoming attacks. You won't stagger, but you'll still lose a noticeable amount of HP. This may not sound like much of a good thing, but take note that they have the fastest deployment speed. If your character has abilities that reward you for just guarding, i.e. blocking enemy attacks right before they connect, bucklers will make this task much easier. The mid-tier shield is called, well, a shield. It's slightly slower than the buckler, but it absorbs most incoming attack damage. Towers take the longest to deploy, but they absorb all incoming damage. This was what I mainly used throughout the game. I probably would have gone with a buckler a bit more, but my timing for just guarding is atrocious. If the origami was winding up for a big light show attack and I had the tower, I just put that thing up and waited for the fireworks to finish. Now there's also a bullet editor that you can use to create your own custom bullets. This was in Resurrection as well, and while you can create some really broken bullets with this, I had a hard time understanding it. I tried playing around with it a bit more in this game, but I could never really create something that was worth using. If you can't figure it out, don't sweat it. You'll end up getting blood bullets as you progress through the game, and those work pretty well too. The skill system is back. When you finish missions, you'll acquire abandoned Goddarks, and these have skills that you can install into your own Goddark. So for example, if you find an abandoned short blade that has a melee attack skill attached to it, you can obtain that melee attack skill by installing it on your own short blade. The same goes for shields and guns, and each piece of equipment can store up to 4 slots. There are also compound skills that count as 1 slot but have the effects of 2 or more smaller skills attached to it. So yeah, if you can find some good skills, you can make your character quite the powerhouse. However, don't forget about your teammates. They end up earning AP when you take them on missions, and you can spend that on skills for them too. Most of their skills are the same ones you can get: increased melee attack, increased gun damage, more HP, more defense. You can teach them how to use different types of bullets, like that healing that saved me more times than I like to admit, and the list goes on. A lot of the non-combatant characters have skills too, and these are usually things like redrawing skill cards, increasing the amount of rare items you get after missions, bypassing mission reward requirements, etc. There's also a new feature called the Link Support. These are special devices that use abilities from out-of-combat allies to buff your team. Each character in the game has their own little perk, like a free burst, increased elemental damage, faster movement speed, lowering origami defense, and the like. However, the thing that really sets the combat of God Eater 2 apart from the first game are the blood arts. If you're playing the games in chronological order, you're gonna realize that these end up replacing the Predator styles in Resurrection, and vice versa if you're playing in release order. Blood arts are special attacks that either modify your light, heavy, or unique attacks for each melee weapon. Some of them add an aura or projectile to your regular swings to make them stronger, some give your character an extra finishing move at the end of your combo, a few of them even turn your attack into something completely new. My only complaint is the fact that you you can only have one at a time. I feel like it really wouldn't hurt to at least be able to equip one ground blood art, one mid-air blood art, and then one for your weapon's special move. Despite this though, the blood arts really keep the game feeling fresh and it made all the weapons that much more fun to use. There's one more part of the combat that I need to talk about: the Blood Rage. A mechanic that's so overpowered, it has its own theme song. Okay, maybe calling it overpowered is a bit misleading because that would imply that you can just flip a switch and activate it, but it's still pretty damn strong. You're invincible while it's active, so you can just charge it and spam to your heart's content. Attacks do way more damage, charged abilities take way less time to pull off, firing your gun doesn't drain oracle points, so you can spam that too, and you have infinite sidestepping. Now, before you get too excited though, it does take some work to get this thing up and running. First of all, there's a meter. It goes up to 400%, and you'll need at least 100 for one Blood Rage session. When you start up Blood Rage, you'll go through a series of menus. This phase is called the Pledge. You choose which origami you want to target, and then you have to select a bunch of conditions. Terms and conditions, if you will. These are going to be tasks that you'll have to complete if you want Blood Rage to activate. Things like devouring the enemy a certain amount of times, breaking a bond, dealing a certain amount of damage, etc. How many of these you decide to take on is up to you, but once you've read and agreed to the terms and conditions, you'll have to fulfill that oath. So let's say you pledge to devour the enemy once and deal a total of 5,000 damage. You'll be given roughly 30 seconds to do all of that to the origami you selected if you want Blood Rage to activate. If time runs out and you still haven't met any of those goals, you won't get Blood Rage. If your character dies during the pledge, you won't get Blood Rage. Thankfully, anything your teammates do counts towards the oath as well, so it isn't as bad as it sounds. Once you finish everything on your to-do list, boom, you've got Blood Rage. Have fun. Like I said, it does take some effort to get it running, but it's really useful if you're in a pinch. Like if you're in a group fight with like 3 origami, you're getting your ass handed to you and you really just need to quickly take out one to even up the battle, you know, Blood Rage would definitely come in handy there, so yeah, Blood Rage. It's pretty cool. As far as the story goes, I really enjoyed it. It stands neck and neck with the first game's story as far as how good it was. All the new characters were very enjoyable and played off of each other quite well. This game has 2 story arcs as opposed to Resurrection, which had 3, and during the first few hours video, I had praised the game for having better pacing than the last one, but I'm gonna have to retract that statement since this only applies to the first arc. The game's second arc did kinda drag a bit. I could remember doing several missions before something truly important would happen, and then, you know, they really did throw a lot of survival missions at you towards the end, which I'll get into a bit later. I got some words for those survival missions, let me tell you. I also had a couple of qualms with the ending, which I'll talk about in greater detail a bit later, but overall, it's still a good story. As I said before, this game and Resurrection run on the same engine, and aside from one game having blood arts and the other having predator styles, the gameplay is almost identical otherwise. Therefore, a lot of the issues that I had with Resurrection also carried over into its chronological sequel. Now, just like with the weapons, I have no problem listing some of these issues again, namely the ones that still bugged me. The camera wasn't any better. As I said in the Resurrection review, this is probably just because the game was originally released on handhelds and then ported to PS4 and PC later. Regardless, I still think it's way too close to the main character. And this might not be too much of an issue when you're just fighting one origami, but when you're fighting multiple origami, it can be very hard to keep track of all of them at once. And yes, I know you can give orders to your teammates, but it really feels hit or miss, and spending a whole nother game having to deal with that wonky command system only solidified this for me. The one you'll probably use most often is Split Up, since ideally it's supposed to make your team scatter in different directions to break up origami groups. But unfortunately, it isn't that simple. There may be multiple origami on the field, but oftentimes they're each locked on to one person. So even if you split up, they'll just follow that one person, and then you're quickly trying to get the whole group back together before your poor teammate gets torn apart. Like if you give orders at the start of the mission, it's all good, but when you do it in the heat of battle, everyone kind of just runs around in circles like headless chickens half the time. If I could have given orders to individual party members, that definitely would have helped, but I think I've made my point. If your team gets surrounded by origami, suck it up and hit them hard, because you'll have a hard time splitting them up 9 times out of 10. And if you couldn't already tell, I absolutely hated fighting 2 or more origami at once. Like I said, it'd probably be fine if the camera was zoomed out enough to keep track of them, but it isn't. Sometimes you'll be getting bodied by one origami and you run away to heal only to get sniped by the other one, but you couldn't see the second one to begin with because it was in your blind spot. I just don't like how on missions with multiple origami, the game just says, well, divide and conquer and then you'll do better, but the mechanics for doing that are pretty unreliable more often than not. It's basically this game's version of let them eat cake, but I digress. I had criticized the first game for not having a lot of maps, but that didn't really bother me in this game, and even so they did add some new areas, so it's all good there. However, one of the things that I just couldn't bring myself to like were the survival missions. These were also in Resurrection, but none of those were mandatory, so this was my first experience with them, since they were mandatory in this game. It's accepted at the counter just like a normal mission, but these missions are split up into different phases, so you're essentially being forced to do 3 to 5 missions in a row, so there's no coming back to replenish items, and you'll have to preset a few loadouts since you won't be able to modify your weapons or blood arts once you start the mission. Like, imagine playing Mario Kart, but you get slower after each lap, less items start showing up on the field, and then on the last lap everyone's got a blue shell at the ready. That's what these things feel like. The only thing I actually liked about these were the little menus in between phases that showed your group camping out. It was pretty nice to see what some of these characters did to pass the time when they aren't busy killing animal-shaped deities. But outside of that, you're making your way through, you can feel your items slowly depleting. Oh, and speaking of items, you might know that the mission has multiple phases, but your teammates don't. It's not uncommon for them to burn through all their healing items during rounds 1 and 2 and then get steamrolled during 3, 4, and 5. By the time you get to the final phase, you're all alone, your team is dead, and you're probably not in the best condition either, but that Congo Quartet doesn't care. Seriously though, those last few missions leading up to the final boss were way harder than the final boss itself. The mere fact that the final boss was fighting us on their own was what made all the difference in the end. Seriously, this needs to go in the Origami Handbook. If you don't have an AoE capable of one-shotting the entire team without warning, you should be accompanied by a partner at all times. Wait, I just complained about that though. Alright, I'm about to start talking about the story, so spoilers start here. Mostly for this game, but I will reveal a few of the plot twists from the first game in here as well if necessary. So if you're watching this video and haven't played either of the games, this is your warning. If you're still here at this point, I'm assuming you either played the game already or you don't care, so let's get started. First of all, the setting. In the first few hours video I made, I said the Far East branch is more of an afterthought than anything. This is not true at all. The Far East branch is often called the front lines in this game, and you head there quite early, and you'd better get comfortable because the den from the first game does become your permanent home in a short while. I feel like most of the characters, save for 2, got an adequate amount of spotlight, and I really did grow to like them. The protagonist's canonical blood power is called Evoke, and it's a power that ends up awakening special abilities for the other blood members and even a few older generation God Eaters if you decide to take their side quests. Julius was the captain, and in a very Lindo-like fashion does leave the team early on, essentially gives up his life to save the day, but then it turns out he wasn't dead after all and the team saves him at the end of the expansion. His blood power is control, and during gameplay this basically just sends all teammates into burst mode. While he wasn't the first child to end up in Rachel's orphanage, I believe he was the only one who she officially adopted as her own son. As I said during first few hours, Sheila is very prim and proper, and this was due to her being Julius's bodyguard back at the orphanage. She was taught that rules were more important than anything, and deviating from them for any reason at all was never okay. It actually sounds a lot like public school now that I think about it. Because of this though, she never had a chance to develop decent social skills, but this does change when she joins Blood. She turns out to be a genuinely kind and caring person, and it doesn't take long for her to break out of her shell. She's also quite handy with a gun. Canon needs to take notes because this girl knows how to aim. The Origami could be juggling me across the map and Shield would still be able to send a healing bullet my way. Her blood power is called Intuit. During gameplay that just means that you can keep track of who's locked on to who and how much HP the Origami have left. While I liked all the blood members, Gilbert definitely became one of my favorites. He started off being a bit blunt and kinda harsh at times, but it came from a place of love. Like Shield, he genuinely cared for everyone and didn't want anybody throwing their lives away if they didn't have to. His backstory with his friend Haru and their superior Kate was kinda predictable, but still pretty good. His blood power, Inspire, raises the group's attack power during gameplay. Nana... It's pretty clear she's the fan service character, but she's still great. Most of the blood unit tends to be a bit reserved, but she more than makes up for that, and the backstory about her late mother actually explains why she likes eating so much. Her blood power, Attract, causes all locked on Origami to pay attention to her. I liked Romeo, but his death early on in the game really did cause his character development to take a hit. Anyway, like Nana, he's also pretty bright and cheery. He's kind of the jester of the group, but he did this to cover up his own insecurities. He was the last person to awaken his blood power, and before that, he genuinely felt like the only thing he was bringing to the table was his jokes. When Gilbert called him out on his performance one day, Romeo ran from the branch, but an elderly couple in the outer ghetto convinced him to return and assured him that he meant more to his teammates than he thought. Romeo did unlock his blood power, Heart, just minutes before his death. During gameplay, this blinds and deafens Origami for a short while. Livy doesn't show up until the Rage Burst arc, and obviously because she was kind of the flagship character of that expansion, she got a decent amount of spotlight. You remember how I said that God Eaters have to be compatible with their God Arcs? I meant that. Goddarks can totally turn on the user if they have incompatible oracle cells, and this also means that God Eaters can't safely wield other people's Goddarks either. Livy is sort of the exception. She has her own Goddark, but she can adapt to others if she needs to, although it will cause her a great deal of pain. Her blood power, Kindness, isn't learned until the end of the game, but it grants the player a free revive if they fall in battle. I want to talk about the main antagonist next, since this is probably what will stick with me the most even after I leave this game behind. The main antagonist of God Eater 2 Rage Burst is Rachel, and I didn't suspect her at all. At first I really thought it was going to be Gren, because he had all the qualities of a villain. He was selfish, unabashedly so, he only cared about profits and gains, and he treated most of the characters like objects, especially the God Eaters.
My apologies for those rude children. I am ashamed. They're really only good for fighting, you know.
Saying that we're only good for fighting as if that's a bad thing considering the game's setting. I don't see you bringing your fat ass to the front lines to fight Origami on the regular. Actually, now that I've mentioned that, I do like how God Eater 2 devotes a little more time to plot points outside of the Origami threat. In the first game, you only saw what happened within Fenrir and its Far East branch. You were told that humanity was struggling, but since all of the main characters were either soldiers or Fenrir's staff, you didn't know what it felt like to be a normal person living during that time. The only time you got some insight into that was when Coda was talking with his mom and sister. That was about it. In God Eater 2, you're given a bit more info regarding how normal people get by. A lot of it comes through a journalist named Satsuki, who kinda tagged along with the group during the first half of the game. The reality is that even though the work that the God Eaters do is extremely dangerous, they're compensated quite well, at least in comparison to everyone else. They get a comfortable place to stay, they have enough to eat. If you go on a survival mission with certain characters, you can see them playing video games or they might ask you to watch a movie with them on their tablet, or those things could be phones too, I don't know. The games take place in like the 2070s, so it's possible phones just become that big by then, but you get my point. Apparently they do have some luxuries, but the average Joe outside of Fenrir, who isn't a God Eater, who isn't an operator, who isn't a branch director, who isn't a scientist or an engineer working on something, they are probably not living like that. It was a brutal reminder that even though things were this bad and humanity as a species was in trouble, Fenrir was still a corporation, and at the end of the day, for many if not most of the people in charge, it wasn't about saving lives, it was about that green. What was I originally talking about again? I got kinda off topic there. Alright, Gren. I just feel like there are many more branch directors like him. People like Sakaki or Feldman, who shows up later, are probably the exception, not the rule. Anyway, I suspected Gren, but it turns out he just came and went. He's mentioned briefly in the Rage Burst arc, and if his database description is anything to go by, it looks like he'll be bearing the brunt of the blame for everything that went wrong during the first arc, which I'll get to in a little bit. I also heavily suspected Leia. I didn't rule out the possibility that one of the Claudius sisters was up to no good, but I was sitting there thinking that if that was true, then it would totally be Leia. I don't know if it was just because Leia was taller than a lot of the other characters, or that maybe I underestimated Rachel because she was wheelchair bound, but it wasn't Leia. If her main purpose in the game was to serve as some sort of literal red herring, it worked. I was so busy waiting for Leia to turn into Johannes 2.0 that I completely ignored Rachel, acting all sweet, pretending that the orphanage that they opened up was done out of the kindness of her heart and totally not because she plans to destroy the world or anything like that. I guess I should talk about that next though, considering Rachel hogs the title of main antagonist for not one but two story arcs. First off, I guess I should explain how she got in the wheelchair in the first place. So yeah, story time. Get comfortable. When Rachel was little, she hardly ever spoke, and this really annoyed Leia, and one day they got in an argument and Leia pushed her down the stairs, which damaged her spinal cord and her brain. Things weren't looking so good for Rachel and their father was getting desperate, but fortunately at the time Soma, a main character from the last game, had just been born, and if you played the first game you already know about that whole thing, but essentially he was the first kid to be born with a bias factor inside of him. The doctor said injecting the same bias factor into Rachel could save her, though the chances would be low. Daddy Claudius decided to risk it, and Rachel, while coming out partially origami, did come out okay. It didn't restore her legs, but she was fine otherwise, or so it seemed. Leia took note of the fact that Rachel became much more talkative after the incident though. But outside of that, all seemed normal with the Claudius family thereafter. Leia, as you can imagine, was very sorry for what happened between them. She promised Rachel that she'd give her anything she wanted, and Rachel took full advantage of that. They both aspired to become scientists, and their father happily funded their projects, the two most notable being the Magnolia Compass Orphanage and the Goddark Soldiers. The orphanage was pretty much Rachel's excuse to seek out children who had the potential to use blood powers, and this made it much easier for her to recruit the kids who would eventually eventually form the blood unit. She also used many of the other children there as test subjects for her rather inhumane experiments. The Goddark Soldiers, well, it's just as it sounds. They were meant to be stronger God Eaters. However, Rachel and Leia had two very different opinions on how the soldiers should be operated. Leia wanted the soldiers to be more like suits, where it would still require a human pilot, and I guess that would reduce the chances of having the things malfunction. However, Rachel insisted that the Goddark Soldiers function like robots, where they're controlled remotely. She said it was so that real people wouldn't have to keep risking their lives to fight Aragami, but obviously this was just a front to hide her true intentions. Their father eventually finds out about Rachel experimenting on the children and reminds her that the reason he put his energy behind their work was in hopes that they'd help people, not hurt them. And then Rachel was all like, "Yup, you damn right I was pumping kids full of bias factors they weren't compatible with. When I fell down the stairs, I met Papa Aragami himself, and he said he likes his corpses nice and tender." You know, that's pretty damn close to what she actually said in the game, but of course Daddy Claudius wasn't happy. He headed out to go report her, only for Rachel's prototype Goddark Soldier 0 to find and devour him. This was not a coincidence. With their father out of the way, Rachel was free to carry out her experiments, and Leia did help her through a good chunk of it. Rachel's ultimate goal was to create another devouring apocalypse, which was the same thing Johannes was trying to do in the first game. But unlike Johannes, who wanted to end the world but still save a handful of capable people to rebuild, Rachel just said screw it, end the world and leave nothing behind. I'm almost certain that Leia and most of the other Friar staff knew nothing about the devouring apocalypse part, and it wasn't until they started to realize something bigger was in the works that Leia finally ran away to notify the main characters, who were in the Far East branch at the time. During the time skip between God Eater Resurrection and God Eater 2, a mysterious red rain had also begun to fall, and anyone caught in it would contract a disease called the Black Plague. It would leave black marks on a person's body and eventually kill them after some time. It was incurable, but I do think it could be stalled. But still, there was no cure to make it completely go away. This whole red rain thing was a mystery until it was revealed that Rachel was the one controlling it. The purpose of the red rain and the Black Plague was to reveal who the Singularity would be. The Singularity was meant to serve as the catalyst for a devouring apocalypse, and in the first game it was supposed to be Shio, but you know, then she went to the moon, so no apocalypse happened. But now that Rachel was trying to start another one, she was using the red rain to seek one out. To make an already long story a bit shorter, two candidates were revealed, Julius and another girl named Yuno. During one particular mission, Rachel, who did get her way with the remote-controlled Goddark Soldiers by the way, forces them to shut down partway through the mission. Romeo goes out in the rain to help with the evacuation of the civilians, most notably the same elderly couple whom he had met before. All the civilians make it out safe, but Romeo does end up dying in Julius's arms. Rachel also cleverly managed to shift the blame by asking her co-worker, Dr. Cujo, to take full responsibility for anything that happened to the Goddark Soldiers a few days before the incident, and the man did it without a second thought too. After Romeo's funeral, Julius decides to leave the blood unit to join Rachel. Remember, Leia hadn't run from Friar yet, so none of the God Eaters knew yet that Rachel was bad and that Romeo's death was actually planned. I feel like Julius really took the whole incident to heart. He blamed himself for what happened to Romeo, and Rachel took full advantage of this. She explained to him that if they can perfect the remote Goddark Soldier research, then they can fully replace God Eaters and no one would have to risk their lives again like Romeo did. Her plan was to upload Julius's fighting style and abilities into the Goddark Soldiers, even though it turns out that these things didn't fight like Julius at all. So now Julius is helping her, but make no mistake, he's getting screwed over in this whole thing too, because as soon as Rachel's done with him and the Black Plague he contracted starts to wear down on him, she sicks her prototype Goddark Soldier 0 on him just like she did with her own father. He does end up mutating into the next Singularity, and the protagonist and company had to step in to stop them. Get this though, they had to stop the devouring apocalypse by having Yuno sing. The sound of her voice was used to contain the apocalypse. You remember how I said among the Black Plague victims, Yuno was the only other candidate who was eligible for a singularity? She was going to sing and use her singularity powers to amplify the song. The blood unit would protect her in the meantime. I really found this to be quite the stretch, but oh well. They get to see Julius one last time before he contains both forces, stops the red rain, and purges the Black Plague from the planet. The only thing that's left is a tall structure that people would later name the Spiral Tree. Just like with Johannes in the first game, Fenrir tells the public a slightly different story from what actually happened, most notably twisting the facts to make Rachel and Julius sound like heroes who were fighting alongside Blood the entire time and died during the final battle. Now, it is worth noting that Rachel had sent an email to Cujo shortly before her death. Because of having Rachel as his wallpaper on both of his monitors didn't already tip you off, this man did have the hots for Sadist McWheelchair over here. She apologized for treating him like shit and basically sweet-talked him into carrying out out her backup plan. The game then spends a chapter or two just cooling off and having the characters do normal hunts. Quite a few familiar faces make their reappearance here, and then the Rage Burst arc begins. So one day, Isaac Feldman, the director of Fenrir's Intelligence Center, arrives in the Far East. The Intelligence Center wanted to conduct research on the tree. They carried this out using piloted Goddark Soldiers for the most part, while the other God Eaters would hold off nearby Aragami to keep the area safe. During one of these experiments, they were planting devices around the tree to monitor activity. However, Kujo had installed something extra into the device that he was in charge of. It was the same thing Rachel had used to autopilot the Goddark Soldiers back in the first arc, and when he planted this into the ground, it contaminated the tree. It sought out any remnants of Rachel and gathered them back together, essentially resurrecting her. Her goal was simple. She had control of the tree now, so she was going to use it to create another devouring apocalypse. Livy also discovered that Julius was still alive in the tree as well, since she had briefly used his Goddark, so their mission was simple. Step 1, stop Rachel. Step 2, save Julius. The game's plot was pretty straightforward from there. The ending was good, albeit a bit weird. The final boss fight against Rachel was pretty easy compared to everything else in the tree, but I guess I shouldn't be complaining considering I spent a good portion of the video bitching about Aragami group fights and survival missions. Grab any sword you want, keep whacking her tentacle arm thingies and she'll eventually go down. I used Blood Rage twice, but that was just to speed things up. Rachel, now on death's door for real this time, gets desperate and tries to absorb Julius for some inexplicable reason. I mean, didn't you need him to trigger the devouring apocalypse? Why are you trying to absorb him at this point? I wonder if doing this would have started the apocalypse prematurely. I don't know, I feel like they could have made that part a little clearer. Anyway, she tries to ingest the poor guy, but the protagonist reaches into her chest and pulls him out at the last minute. You could have at least taken her out to dinner first, damn. Then she dies, and everyone uses their blood power to amplify Romeo's Goddark and stop the apocalypse. Rachel gives her final words, something about a restless god or whatever. It's implying that she wasn't really herself and something else was driving her to do all that evil shit. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I still like to believe that on her way down the stairs she just hit her head so badly it permanently loosened some screws.
The origami bond just cracked!
As far as the apocalypse is concerned, they didn't actually stop it, they just slowed it down to a snail's pace. So instead of just erasing everything in one fell swoop, it kind of reset the planet, but in a good way. The Earth is starting to heal and even purge the Oracle cells from the blood units' bodies, essentially turning them back into everyday Joe Schmoes again. And I guess I should take the time now to address the elephant in the room. Well, he's not quite in the room since I haven't mentioned him yet, more like approaching the door. Romeo comes back to life. And I'm not really sure how I feel about that. First of all, don't get me wrong, I'm happy that he's back. It's nice that the blood unit was reunited and they took Livy in as one of their own, but at the same time, bringing Romeo back did feel odd. Like with Julius, it was different because he wasn't dead, he was just stuck in the tree holding back the apocalypse. Once Rachel tainted the tree, rescuing him was the goal. But when Romeo died, Julius cried over his dead body. They buried him and had the funeral. The writers closed off any narrative gaps that might have feasibly brought him back into the picture. This wasn't like Lindo in the first game where they just left it up to interpretation, where Alyssa accidentally walled him in with a couple origami and maybe the PETA killed him, which in turn gave the writers enough freedom to say, no it didn't, Shio saved him. And I think what really bugs me about it is the fact that he came back at the last second. When he came back, the story was basically over, so there was no time left to flesh out his character more, unless you took on his character episodes after the game was over. Most everyone had grown quite a bit since Romeo's death, both in personality and in literal in-game stats, so it felt really strange just having him back. Granted, when he died, he did go out on a high note, but the only other thing you learned about him after that was that his blood power was heart, and it blinded and deafened Aragami, and the fact that he was friends with Livy back at the orphanage. The same could be said about Julius, but once again, rescuing him was the goal, so he was more of a when than an if. Look, I don't know. Like I said, I'm happy that he's back, don't get me wrong, but it just felt random, that's all. Blood catches Romeo up on everything that's happened, and everyone does decide to get new armlets and become God Eaters again. So overall, very good story. It wasn't perfect. As you can tell, I did have a few qualms with it, but I still left feeling very satisfied. And at the end of the day, I guess that's what matters most. Now that I've gotten the main points out of the way, I'll use the rest of the video to talk about about any little things that I might have forgotten to mention before. First of all, the Scions. I like to call these things legendary skinned Aragami because they're usually high quality reskins with their own special abilities. And what's funny is that you'll look at it on the mission select screen and it'll look like something new, but then you'll start the mission and you'll realize it's got the same anatomy and moveset as something you've already fought. So for example, the Kabbalah is the Scion counterpart to the Gaboro, and he's a pretty cool guy. He uses electricity instead of water, and if he's not locked onto you, he gives everyone a permanent level 3 burst until you disturb him. So if you see this guy on a mission, take him out last. The Garm was a species introduced in God Eater 2, and its Scion counterpart is the Marduk. His special ability attracts all Aragami to him, but outside of that, he's pretty cool. Don't have anything too bad to say about him, honestly. The Nyx Alpha is the Scion version of the Sariel, and you can only kill it with guns. And no, it's not like you can hit it with your sword for 0 damage and still get Oracle for it. Your attacks are literally just gonna phase through it, so that's pretty annoying. Lian G is the closest thing this game has to an e-girl. She's got thick thighs and an army of Ogretail simps at her beckon to distract you if need be. I've heard stories about the Magatsu Kyubi, but I've never actually fought it. Its super special Scion X-Men superpower allows it to permanently lower your max HP during battle. No thank you, I'll pass. There is more, but those are just a few examples. Later on, during the Rage Burst arc, you'll also come across another type of modified Aragami, the Arc Aberrants. They're basically recolored Aragami that have partially fused with Goddarks, so now your favorite Aragami are even more annoying. For example, the Magna Gawain is a recolored Chrome Gawain, but he's got 2 shield pieces on his arms, and they explode when you get too close, so you still have to be careful even during the few times you do find an opening. The Raksha Congo is basically a red Congo with 2 boost hammers that serve as jetpacks to bloat its attack range. The Caligula Xeno is a recolored Caligula with a horn attack very much capable of one-shotting you, and the list goes on. My god, we've got reskinned Aragami, Aragami with special powers, Aragami with Goddark strapped to their bodies. Next you're gonna tell me there are Aragami that eat you back. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned how you don't need to play the first game to understand this one, and one of the main reasons I said that is because most of the main characters in this game do have character episodes that really help if you're trying to learn more about them. Want to learn why Cannon keeps hitting you instead of the giant monster on the screen? Play her character episode. Want to learn more about the defense units since they really only show up during the filler arc? Play through their character episodes. Want to learn why Lindo has a gauntlet on his arm and wields a different looking blade from everyone else? There's actually a set of missions centered around the Hannibal species that explains just that. Want to learn what drove Arena to become a God Eater?
Eric, look out!
You get my point. A good chunk of the main points from the first game are explained in God Eater 2 one way or another. Even if they don't cover it in the main story, you could just do the character episodes and get your fill there. Although I would recommend you play the first game anyway if you have the time, because it's pretty good, but you get my point. If 2 is the only one you want to play or can afford to play, it doesn't keep you in the dark about past events. It took me around 80 hours or so to clear the main story, with a little bit of grinding in between every now and then, but if you're a stickler for post-game content, this game has you covered. There are a few side chapters. One of them features the operators, which I never bothered to do, and as I said before, there's another one that goes into greater detail about Lindo's story arc from the first game. I almost cleared that one, but then got stopped dead in my tracks by the Blitz Hannibal at the end. God, I hate that thing so much. I'm not sure how I managed to beat this thing back in Resurrection, but somehow I did. He wasn't mandatory this time though, so I was like, nah, I'm not putting myself through this again. There's another behemoth in this game worth mentioning, the Crimson Orochi. He's the game's super boss, and when I first heard about him I was pretty excited. This is the mission you have to do to unlock the reinforced weapons in the game, which are the strongest weapons if you didn't know, and I was like, cool, okay, sign me up. I beef up my shield quite a bit, make sure all my skills are max level, go in there with the dream team, Gilbert, Nana, and Shield, and we get our asses handed to us. I couldn't even fall back on Blood Rage because he had a shit ton of HP and the pledge requirement is proportional to how much HP the enemy has. There's no easy way to deal all that damage in 30 seconds and chances are he'll probably KO you before you can finish the pledge anyway. Honestly, I could probably beat him with some practice and dedication and cheese bullets, but I don't really want to. At that point, I'd had enough. Overall, God Eater 2 Rage Burst made for an excellent sequel. I loved the cast, and while the story was wackier than the first game, it was still very entertaining. People who like variety will be thoroughly entertained with the different blood arts available for each weapon, and there's plenty of extra stuff to do outside of the main story that'll keep you busy for hours on end. And that marks the end of the video. Just like with Resurrection, this one did end up being quite lengthy, so if you made it this far, thanks for hearing me out. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to hear me rattle on about other JRPGs, and I will see you all again when I start up God Eater 3.